Hello everybody, it's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming, continuing our tier list ranking of all of the cards in the Unrestricted Cube. This time, talking about blue. If you want a lowdown of kind of why I'm doing this, what's going on with the Unrestricted Cube, go ahead and check out the previous video on the white cards. But I did say at the end of that hour and 20-minute long video that I would try to speed up the process, so I will leave the housekeeping up to that video. You can go check it out to see where I landed on all of the white cards in the cube. But today we are going to talk about blue cards. Before I get into that, remember you can always support our cube content by either liking, commenting, and subscribing here on the YouTube channel, or just joining the Jank Diver Gaming Discord. You don't even have to play cube with us, but as long as you love Magic and you want to talk about Magic or even just draft or constructed, there are places to do that in our channel. So you'll find links to this tier list and that Discord down below, and just having you in our Discord, having more Magic members join us to talk about cube and help us perfect our cubes means a lot to us. And of course, you can actually come play cube. The Unrestricted Cube, where you'll see all these cards, is our typical Sunday night draft, which starts at 7:30 EST. It does have a lot of rares, as we'll see, and mythics, so it could be a little bit wild card intensive, but we offer a peasant cube on Wednesdays to keep things fresh and consistent for people who don't have such big collections. But back to blue. So blue is kind of our ugly duckling right now, for lack of a better term. We are at the peak of blue being, I think, the worst color in the cube, and it has been the worst color for quite a while, but not to the point where it's unplayable. Obviously, we get to curate the cube, so we've shifted things around a little bit to give blue more of an edge against a lot of other colors, and specifically I'm talking about blue control. Blue tempo feels like it's on the up and up. Blue blink feels like a real deck, a real contender in our format. It's blue control that suffers a lot, and since a lot of people identify as control players and want to play a control game, we want to make sure that their strategy is viable in our cube. So we've made a lot of tweaks. We've added a lot of cards that look very weird in a cube with some all-stars, but I'll try to justify those when we get to them. And for now, we're going to go ahead and rank all of the blue cards. Again, I just want to point out, if you watch the white video, these headings are like kind of loose. You know what I mean when I put a card at S and when I put a card at D. Best of the best, worst of the worst, everything in between. It's mid-range, these are the mid-rangey stuff. So let's go ahead and get into it, starting off with our first card. The blue actually has 2 or 3 alchemy cards, so I do want to make sure I'm keeping up with the card on Scryfall here. The first one is Clone Crafter. For those of you who have never seen this card in your life, because it is a digital-only card, it's a 2-mana 1/2 that ETBs and creates a card in your hand that's a copy of a creature in your opponent's deck. And they do not get to know what it is. So you just add a card to your hand. It's basically 2-mana 1/2, draw a card, but the card you draw is something from your opponent's deck. I actually hate the play patterns with this card. In fact, multiple people have voiced their opinions about hating this card, not just because it's alchemy, the A word is automatically going to bring down some people's opinions, but the fact that your opponent doesn't get to see the card that you get with this is kind of miserable. I wish it revealed what it got, because there's just so many gotcha moments, and it kind of breaks the immersion of a cube, a singleton cube, where the cards in your deck are supposed to be yours and yours alone, and your opponent didn't get them, so you know what they have. And then, haha, I played Clone Crafter, so I actually have a card that you spent a cube pick on. It's not a great design. It's a little tilting. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it is filling a role for us as a 2-drop for the Blink deck. We saw Spirited Companion in the white section. There's also Thraben Inspector. Those are fine Blink targets that are just like, I'm going to curve, 2-drop, draw a card, ETB into Soul Herder. This is kind of doing the same thing for blue. The only real other option we have is Fibblethip, and Fibblethip, doesn't let you ephemerate and stuff like that, so it's a little bit on the weaker side. Clone Crafter is a very powerful card, but once we get a really satisfying blue 2-drop effect for the Blink deck, maybe something like a Phantasmal Image or something, we'll probably cut Clone Crafter. For now, it is filling a role for us, even though it's not great. So I'm going to put this in C. On power level, it's like A, because it just does very powerful things, especially if you can blink it. But I'm going to put it in C just to kind of hedge my bets a little bit as far as like us wanting to get this card out of the cube, but it kind of being a workhorse for us right now. And I am sad to say, as much as I love Thing in the Ice, I'm going to put this in C as well. So if you are, a longtime Magic player, you've dabbled in Constructed, the times where Thing in the Ice has been a relevant top tier card in Constructed formats. You might come into this cube, see the card, draft it, and be like, ooh, that is a great signal to move into a spells deck. I think it actually underperforms in this cube, and I'm a huge Thing in the Ice lover. I think the design of the card is awesome. I remember it in Constructed. I would draft it every chance I got and build around it. But our cube is lacking these 1-mana cantrips, and I think those are really the thing that pushes Thing in the Ice over the top. Right now we have, I think, 4 1-mana cantrips of varying power level, and we have access to a few other like really weak ones like Birthday Escape, and I should bring up Thing in the Ice here. I just don't think this card gets there. I don't think I've ever even seen Awoken Horror on the battlefield, and I've played this card enough where I can get the first 2 counters off, and then I fizzle out a little bit, and maybe I'm not committed to the theme hard enough, but when my opponent plays this, and is just blocking with it while I'm playing an aggressive deck, I'm usually thrilled because I can just jam all of my creatures into it with no repercussions. So I think Thing in the Ice is like a classic card that probably gets better in our cube the more that we get these good playable cantrips. But until then, I think it's a huge underperformer and might not even be worth a slot until that actually ends up happening. Speaking of classic cards, Snapcaster Mage, which, that whole Shadows of the Past thing that they did with the Shadows over Innistrad remaster, just that gave us access to so many sweet cards. I guess I'll use this art for Snapcaster Mage. I think realistically Snapcaster performs at like an A level regularly, but it's such a classic and it's so powerful when it does the thing that it's an S tier card. Like, people are willing to first pick this. Obviously, if I see Snapcaster in a pack with powerful cards, I'm going to pull it to the front and have it as an option to draft, and it is a reason to move into the spells deck. Bolt Snap Bolt is something that this cube is capable of, and that's, traditionally been a very powerful line of play. That's true here as well. We have very efficient spells for Snapcaster to be able to flash back. We have all of the best spells like Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt, so on and so forth. So Snapcaster, it's very hard to build a deck where this card is not at least serviceable, and most of the time it's like one of the best cards that you can get. Being able to flash back one of the cantrips as like a base level is just a good spot to be in. I'm on the internet in 2023 explaining to people why Snapcaster Mage is good. It may be falling off in Constructed, but it's still a very heavily played, powerful cube card. Surge Engine. Okay, this one's for Chris and Teld. They're huge proponents of this card, and power to them. The idea here is that this is a card that can trade off if you need to. Like, if you're playing a control deck or maybe even a tempo deck, you run this out on 2. If your opponent attacks you, you just go ahead and trade it off. But if you ever have open mana and your opponent's not actively pressuring you, you can do the whole hold up a counter spell thing. If they don't give you something to counter, you go ahead and activate an ability, put it up to the next level. All that being said, I think this card sucks. This is like one of the worst cards in the cube to me, and I understand the play patterns. I don't get the justification that Chris puts on it that often, and now Chris and Teld have both said that they have had a lot of success with this card, and they value it very highly to the point where I've watched their drafts and seen them take it, and I'm willing to entertain maybe I'm misevaluating the card, but what happens with these level up cards, and I'll probably do this again when we get to Evolved Sleeper in the black section, is you invest mana into it, and then your opponent kills it in response, and you spent 6-7 mana on a card. You never get this part. If you tell me this happens more than 1 in every 7 or 8 games, I'm going to go ahead and say that's not true, because it just it does not happen. You probably get to this point often enough in games where your opponent is stuck on mana and not interacting with you, but your opponents play interaction. This is cube. You can't dump that much mana into a single card that doesn't protect itself and have it be good. So the baseline of a 2-mana 3/2 that just trades off with your aggressive opponent is fine, but I still don't get the justification of this card. It's not good. I'm taking a little bit of a stance here. I don't think this card is good, but it has its defenders who enjoy the card and get some sort of mileage out of it, even though I think like they would be better off drafting different cards. But, if it works for some people, who am I to tell them not to draft it? My stance on the card is that it's not good. But that's one of the only cards that I'm just actively like, other people think this is good, and I think it sucks. Most of the time we agree on stuff, but we do have our fair share of cards that we don't agree on necessarily all the time. This is one of them. Suspicious Stowaway. Suspicious Stow. So the interesting thing about Suspicious Stowaway is that the back half of this card comes up it almost only comes up in games where your opponent just floods out and can't do things, right? The idea here is you put this in like your control deck, and then you pass the turn to flip it, and then you protect it with the counter spells that you pass the turn with or something like that. Or you just put it in your like blue-white tempo deck, you start attacking, and you improve the quality of your hand over time. First off, Daybound, Nightbound as a mechanic is like so miserable when you only have one or two cards, because it's just the type of thing you forget about. It's especially egregious in paper because it's easy to forget, but even on digital client on Arena where it shows you day and night, you just kind of forget about this, and then you lead to situations where you flipped your opponent's Seafarer and Werewolf, but you had a way to not do that. It wasn't clear, or you just forgot about Daybound, Nightbound. The mechanic sucks. Like, from a mechanical perspective, it's just not a great mechanic. This card on its own is like a fine floor, though. Like, as a looter ill core that improves the quality of your hand, fills up your graveyard, and then occasionally can become this like saboteur that draws cards, even though that happens like very rarely. I think this card is fine for its floor, even though the ceiling is a little bit weaker. Again, it's one of those cards where you can say all you want, like, oh, this is how I'm going to use the card, but you're in cube with powerful cards. Your opponents play interaction. If you just pass the turn with a counter spell and they respond, like, not everything always goes your way. You can't force the flip on this that often. So I think this card is at its best in games where you're already winning because your opponent just like doesn't have stuff to do or missed a land drop or something like that. And that's not like a high evaluation of a card, but I think it's pretty clear that as just like a loot every turn that chips in a little bit of damage, this card is like fine on the front half, even if you don't put a lot of value in the back half of it. And when the back half does come up, it is a very powerful card. Sorry, I keep flipping it back and forth. It's impulsive. So B tier for me. Not first pickable by any means, but it does have its decks where it's good. All right, we got there. Rona, Herald of Invasion. So I do want to preface this by saying that I don't really care much about the back half of this card. It is added utility, so but it doesn't change where I'm going to put this card. I think as far as looting goes, this is what a looter needs to look like in order to keep up with the power level of cards in 2023. Merfolk Looter is traditionally a card that I think is just extremely underpowered that people occasionally have in their cubes. It just does not hold up because the body is just so frail, easy to get rid of, and doesn't participate in combat. Whereas Rona actually does block the 2/2s and 1/1 aggressive creatures and 2/1 Savannah Lions and stuff like that. A 1/3 body is not excellent, but it is fine on a card that you're using for utility. It occasionally does become a 5/5 in the late game, but that's kind of like a last resort type thing. But this Luden is nice, and we've talked about it a lot, but so many cards just are legendary that you just end up untapping this a lot, even when you're not necessarily trying to. Like, we're not playing a legendary matters cube or anything like that, but look right here, legendary, 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 just all in a row. You just end up with enough legendary creatures that you do get extra loots out of this, and you get to just kind of rip through your library. I do wish we had more support for like a graveyard matters theme in blue to take advantage of looting cards away to your graveyard. There's a tiny little bit of that, but not a lot. But for the most part, this is just a high quality looter that helps block, whereas cards like Merfolk Looter, Looter Ilkor, Suspicious Stowaway, they don't quite do it. That being said, I'm not first picking Rona, even though I think it's a perfectly defensible card in most of your blue defensive decks. But I will put it at high B because I think it is one of the better card selection tools that we have access to. Ledger Shredder is up next. Now, I've been wrong about a lot of cards. I misevaluate a lot of cards, but I think Ledger Shredder I had pegged as a very powerful card early on, and happy to know that I get some of them right during the pre-release discussions. when new cards get spoiled, I'm always like, Fabled the Mirror Breaker, is it that good? Things like that. But Ledger Shredder I had pegged as a very powerful card. I think it panned out, and I think it is an A quality card. First off, it's not very hard to just cast this and another spell in the same turn and just have this start out as a 2/4. And even if you're not growing it, you're still looting away. You notice we're talking about a bunch of looters here. The thing that I really like about Ledger Shredder is it kind of stifles your opponent's ability to do things. A lot of times they can't go like bolt this, cast a spell and then bolt this, or cast a draw spell. Oops, I drew bolt. Let me go ahead and use it on a Ledger Shredder, because it just ends up triggering it, and then it's out of range, right? So a 2-mana 1/3 flyer, we already said a 1/3 is fine on a ground creature. You put that on a flyer, it's obviously even better. And then Ledger Shredder is very often a 2/4 or a 3/5. Doesn't usually get much bigger than that, but when you paid a 2-mana initial investment for a 3/5 flyer or a 2/4 flyer, that's really good. If there was just a 1 in a blue 2/4 flyer with like no other text, that by itself would already be like a high B level card, and then put any ability on it, it's A-. It's just really easy to get the first counter on this. It plays well in decks that can chain together spells, like Izzet decks in particular, and then it is a deterrent for your opponent to double cast spells in the same turn. So I think it's quite good. Mercurial Spell Dancer? Yeah. Okay, my piece about Mercurial Spell Dancer, I think this card is a little bit weaker than it looks. Now, if you ignore all this spell text, which is an important part of the card, 2-mana 2/1 can't be blocked is kind of decent already. So that's going to push it out of like DC territory. This is not a card that I think is going to stand the test of time and be in the cube forever, but the baseline of just an unblockable 2-power creature is already pretty good when creatures like this often have some sort of stipulation, like, oh, it must attack alone, or you have to have cast a spell this turn. No, this is just a bear that's unblockable all the time. So I'm going to put it in the B category. The thing that I noticed, and I have played a decent amount of this card, is that the spell text just does not happen that often. It is very, very good when it does, but your opponent can see this, right? If you play this on turn 2, they're not just going to snap off removal spells on like your Rona or something. They're going to wait for you to get a counter or two on this, and then they're going to kill it before you deal combat damage with it. So while this card has a pretty high ceiling, it can do cool things when everything goes your way or your opponent stumbles on removal. You play against Selesnya or something like that. I played this card quite extensively in a recent Roto draft and some of the cube drafts, and I think it underperforms, at least to the point where it's not like one of Blue's best cards. It's certainly in the middle, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in B accordingly, even though, it does have a home. It's a little bit narrow as well. You really only play it in the spell-based decks. You wouldn't put this in like your blue-green ramp deck or anything like that. But blue-white tempo, blue-red spells are kind of the home for it. I don't think I would play this in a hard blue-black control deck either. So half the decks is a solid reason to put this in a B. Fairy Mastermind. This is one where I would have to refer to the judgment of my peers because I have not played the cube since March of the Machine came out. I have to imagine this card is a baseline fine card. I don't know how often you activate that ability, but just 2-mana, 2/1 flash flying, I think is still a good stat line. Just something that lets you operate at instant speed with all of your cheap quench variants and counter spells, and then something that can clock your opponent if you're not committed to using your mana on interaction every single turn. And then a lot of times there are a lot of effects in green and blue in particular that will draw a bunch of cards. In fact, white even has a bunch of card draw now. So there are a lot of matchups where you can sneak this in and get an extra card off of this ability. And then as a desperation move, or maybe you're like super far ahead that you're confident your cards stack up well against your opponents, you can activate this ability and draw your opponent a card in exchange for drawing 2 cards for yourself. So I think the package here is really nice. It's not quite PV, but Utah did a good job as well. I think I'm going to put this card at B. I haven't seen it in action. I think it might be a little bit better than Suspicious Stowaway, but the maybe it's tied with Rona. Maybe it's better. Maybe it's worse. This is one where I would have to kind of field the group's opinion and see where it stands and how it's been playing out and whether it's actually drawing extra cards or not. If this ability triggers less than like 10% of games, then obviously the stats on its own isn't going to pull this card. I think you do need to be drawing off your opponent's draws a decent amount of time. Ether Channeler. Is that the name of the card? It's a very generic name. Ether Channeler was a very exciting card for us when it came out because it let us cut Mana War from the cube for like a rare flexible creature. This is just like run-of-the-mill B. Not strong enough on any given mode to break into the top tier. Not embarrassing by any stretch to put it down below. Fits into a lot of different decks. You can put this in your white tempo deck. You could put this in your blink deck. It's a premium blink target, gives you a lot of flexibility depending on situation. And I've always been the type of person who can put a Mana War in a control deck if I just need another playable, or maybe I didn't quite get there on removal, or I have cheap counter magic where I want to do the bounce and counter type thing. But I'm going to put it like right in the middle. Hopefully by the time I'm done, this Ether Channeler is like the exact middle card, because this is the definition of like a middle B, right? Not super flashy, but a role player. It does its job. Brazen Borrower. I don't know if this is a controversial opinion. This is why I want to do the tier lists and get other people to do them, because I would like to see where people stand on cards. I think Brazen Borrower is an S tier card. I do not think there is a blue deck where you will not play Brazen Borrower, or you don't want to play Brazen Borrower. And I have first picked this in a roto draft. If I know that I'm going to end up blue, this is one of the most important cards, because we don't play a lot of bounce. There's Fate and Hope down here. There's like Baral's Expertise, which is middling. We don't get a lot of bounce. You're hoping as the control deck to just counter everything, but things do slip through the cracks. That's just the nature of Cube. That's just the nature of Magic, is you just don't get to counter everything in the modern day. And Brazen Borrower gives you an out to that. It is like one of the worst bounce spells. If this was just Petty Theft and there was no creature attached to it, we wouldn't even talk about this card, wouldn't even consider it in years. But as a tempo effect that keeps your opponent off and then replaces the kind of downside of a pure bounce spell with a creature that can actually close out the game and operates at instant speed, that's very good. I don't need to go into a diatribe about how good these like adventure creatures were from Eldraine, but not all of them have held up. Brazen Borrower absolutely has held up and is just like one of the best effects that you can have in a blue deck. It makes you feel really safe when you have a counterspell in your hand and when you have Brazen Borrower. And if your opponent just doesn't play anything out, you just get to toss a creature out there. And a 3-power flyer is a decent clock for a control deck. So very happy to have Brazen Borrower in all of my blue decks. All right, next card is a little bit of a breakout card. Chrome Host Seed Shark. Yeah, I got it. Okay, Chrome Host Seed Shark. So this is one that a lot of us were really down on. The obvious comparison that we made was to Haughty Djinn, as Reed Duke pronounces it. This is a card that we had in our cube. In fact, we played them alongside each other and just wanted to see which one was better. And I think a lot of us had firmly landed on Chrome Host Seed Shark being better, and better by such a large degree, in my opinion, that like it embarrasses Haughty Djinn. First off, 3-mana 2/4 flyer. I just got through saying like Ledger Shredder for a 2-mana 2/4 flyer is like really good. 3-mana 2/4 on the ground is not an amazing stat line, but on a flyer that's really good. So you're not like paying a premium for the extra ability tacked on. You are getting a good stat line for the mana that you're paying, and you're getting an ability that is just fantastic. Like, when you read this, you're like, oh, I'm going to cast Counterspell. I'm going to make just a 2/2 incubator. I'm going to have to pay extra mana to turn that into a creature. It sounds like a lot of bells and whistles and a lot of extra mana you need to sink into things, but it turns out it's actually just worth it. Even casting a cantrip on your opponent's end step and just using the 2 spare mana you have open to turn that into a body on board is great. Now, if this was like Talran the Sky Summoner and it was a 4-mana 2/2 with no other abilities other than this, it would be worse. But the fact that you get this ability stapled onto a just good, well-rounded, well-statted creature means that this upside is just very powerful. I'm going to put this at A. I'm going to put it... I almost want to put it above Ledger Shredder because this is the type of card that can actually just close out a game if it goes unchecked. One cool thing with this, too, is if you're playing it in a control deck, which it's not like the premium control finisher or anything, sometimes you have to like wrath your own board, which is why you don't generally play creatures in your control deck. But if you play a Wrath of God, it leaves behind a 4/4 incubator, So you still get something out of it, even if you have to kill your own Chrome Host Sea Shark. But it dodges a lot of the red removal, a lot of the red 2-mana removal, the bolts and stuff like that. And it gives you a proactive and defensive plan at the same time, as long as you fill your deck with non-creature spells. But it triggers off Planeswalkers too. So I think the floor of this card is so high, and the ceiling is like way higher than that if it just goes unchecked. That this has just been an all-star blue card, which I want to say Teld said this was like the best blue creature in the blue section, and I can absolutely believe that. I think I undersold this card very early on, and it's just very apparent to me now that the card is awesome. I think it's one of blue's best creatures. I absolutely agree with that. Not quite to the point where I think it cracks the S tier. It's not in the conversation with like Swords to Plowshares and the Wandering Emperor and Brazen Borrower and stuff like that, but just a notch below. Svaylun, this is one SVY. I have had to write a lot about this creature for Draft Sim, which I write articles for, draftsim.com, and I just can never spell the name right. I got the SVY down though. Svaylun of Sea of Sky. So this was added to our cube during a time where I had not participated with some of the tweaks that had happened. So I didn't even know it got added to the cube. And I was kind of questionable on it for a while. I'm not the type of person who falls into that trap where I'm like, oh, this says Merfolk on it. We're not playing a lot of Merfolk. We shouldn't play this. Like, I understand that you can ignore the typal text on cards like this. And I was just a little skeptical, but it turns out that this was another one that I just undersold. It's a little bit better than I thought. I don't think this is an A quality card because I can't imagine starting off with this over some of these other blue cards, but it plays out like a high B. It's just good stats for the amount of mana you spend. Obviously, this is a Modern Horizons 2 card, so it has numbers on it that don't make a lot of sense comparative to non-Modern Horizon sets. But if you ignore all the Merfolk text, like just a 3-mana 3/4 that attacks and draws a card is something that's kind of hard to stop in combat and hard to remove with like burn or damage-based removal. So it just gets there on stats alone. If this was like a 3-mana 2/2, we probably wouldn't be talking about it or considering it, but it does a good job. It speed bumps your opponent. If your opponent's playing an aggressive deck, it's just a good blocker against them, and dodges a lot of their removal spells. And if you are even remotely proactive and you can handle double blue cost, it does kind of carry the game a little bit by drawing an extra card every turn. Well, just clocking your opponent 3-mana 3/4 in blue is no joke. That leads us to Vendilion Click. Vendilion Click. So we just got this card from a recent anthology, just like the Giver of Runes in the previous video. We haven't actually even played with it at the time of recording. The Unrestricted Cube coming up Sunday is the first time we'll actually have this card in action. That being said, this is a card that we've had pegged as something we wanted for the cube. We want our blue section ideally to be either very powerful cards or operate at instant speed. And you can see already the top end threats operate at instant speed. Now, Click is one of those cards that used to see play extensively, and in Constructed has just completely dropped off. But I think in our cube setting, this should be a high performer. I want to start this off as an A, having not actually tested it in the cube yet. It's hard for it to go wrong. If you've played any Magic with Click, you kind of know how flexible it is. It can mess with your opponent's hand. It can improve the quality of your hand. It is just good stats. Again, the Brazen Borrower stat line for mana cost is exactly the same. And it has some combination of disruptive elements with filter and elements for your own hand. A lot of time you just cast it during your opponent's draw step and kind of mess with things. We don't have the 3-mana Narset in here anymore either, so we're not doing the whole you don't get a draw phase type thing, which I think would make this card more obnoxious. I just think the stat line is what we're looking for in blue. It has that keyword flash for our blue section, which amplifies our counter spells and our instant speed draw spells when we have threats to play at instant speed. And I think Click should relive some of its glory days in the cube. I don't even know if this is the art that they gave us or not, but I think Click is quite strong, and I think it should perform quite strong in our cube. Got Eternal Kefnet. The color pie doesn't matter when blue gets 4-mana 4/5 flyers. I guess that's in blue's color pie actually, but Kefnet is one of those long-standing cards that I'm pretty sure has been in this cube ever since we started it. And anytime it comes up in the conversation about whether or not it's actually pulling its weight, I just have to kind of put my foot down and say this is a 4-mana 4/5 flyer that occasionally has extra text and occasionally comes back when it dies. So yeah, I think it's pulling its weight. It's kind of just a stat beast. I do think this is like an A. It has the 4-drop problem where you just don't need a ton of 4-drops in your deck, so you don't necessarily have to first pick it all of the time. I would rather, I think, start off with some more efficient cards like the Siege Shark and the Ledger Shredder, 2s and 3 drops before I go snapping up a 4-drop. But if I'm in blue, I have room for a mid-rangey threat, or I'm looking for a finisher of some sort, I'm happy to pick up Kefnet. If you're just going in blank, this whole draw your first card each turn thing doesn't actually do very much other than give you a prompt to reveal a land to your opponent like every single turn. But it has very high highs. It, for one, is part of the reason Brainstorm's good in our cube, which is one of the lackluster cantrips for our cube specifically, but is like amazing with God Eternal Kefnet because you can set it up. And then Kefnet's obviously the best thing you can do with Kefnet is reveal Time Warp off of the top, which might be evidence that Time Warp's good, not necessarily Kefnet. But I think the stats pull this card up to A. Like, if this had no abilities and was 4-mana 4/5 flyer, it would probably realistically be like mid-tier B, and we probably wouldn't play it for just stats. But it does have an ability that occasionally just like spikes a removal spell and gives you a free removal spell or a free draw spell. And then obviously you can do this thing. I will say, I think people do the tuck Kefnet thing a little bit too often. I think people's kind of default is to do that because it just guarantees you're going to draw a powerful card in a couple turns. But I think people should evaluate more closely whether or not they actually want to draw this card a couple turns down the line. A lot of time it ends up being a brick if you're just getting beat down by a go wide deck. So you don't always tuck this card, but the fact that you can and draw it back a couple turns later is pretty powerful. So Kefnet still in A territory for me. Saiba Siphoner. Here's another alchemy card. And again, we have made a conscious effort to try and cut back on Siphoner with a Y. There we go. We have made a conscious effort to cut back on alchemy cards. We were playing a lot of them. They're overpowered. They're not necessarily balanced, but occasionally they provide an effect that we really want in our cube that we don't have with other cards that exist in the arena card pool. So we cut our losses and we play a couple of them. Saiba Siphoner is one of them, and I am just going to go ahead and say this is an S tier card, but at the lower end of S because it really only fits the spell-based decks. The fact that this is sometimes 2 mana, and it sometimes gets back a Time Warp or something like that, and you can do these weird loops with the way that it shuffles itself back into the library. Just a very powerful card, and, Flash is huge. There are cards like this on the client, but they're all sorcery speed creatures with ETBs that get spells back. The fact that this one has Flash is just huge, and it lets you kind of sculpt your hand in a way where you can cast this for just 2 mana. Sometimes the last cards in your hand are like a 2-mana Doomblade and Saiba Siphoner, and you have 4 mana, and you get to go Doomblade first, empty your hand out of instants and sorceries, and then just cast this, whereas if this didn't have that line about 2 less mana, you would have to have 6 mana for that play. It just fits in very nicely, does some very powerful things, gets back Time Warps and stuff like that. And I'm a fan of having this sort of graveyard interaction where you can get a spell back. I like recursive-based strategies. This one might end up being a little bit too powerful down the line. It might even be too powerful now. It doesn't look like it if you've ever played with this card, but the play patterns are really powerful with Saiba Siphoner. And we're just hoping to get a similar, comparable type effect to this in the arena card pool on a non-alchemy card. But until then, we'll probably keep playing Siphoner. Very strong, not broken, but in a sense that we can live with it. Which brings us to Whirler Rogue, not a broken card. Also, Whirler Rogue is interesting because it's one of those like peasant all-star cards where it's very good in environments that don't have rares and mythics, but once you kind of field it in with all the rares and mythics, it's like, okay, well, everything is powerful. Obviously, Whirler Rogue is a step below. I think Whirler Rogue is a card that justifies itself, but is always in the conversation whenever we're looking for a cut. Anytime a new effect comes around and we're having a hard time figuring out what the cut is, or a 4-drop, 5-drop blue creature comes around that we're trying to test, we always have to question whether or not Whirler Rogue is the cut. And we usually end up landing on keeping Whirler Rogue because it just does a good job. It plays a good role in the deck. But I don't think this card is a forever card. I'm going to go ahead and put it at high C because it is a card that performs well in a number of different decks, but is not stapled to the cube in such a way that we couldn't cut it if we needed to. Its best home is the Blink deck. Obviously, it's a fantastic Blink target. When you have Soul Herder on board and you play Whirler Rogue and then Blink this and you end up with 4 1/1s, just it's hard to die from that position. And then this whole like tap 2 artifacts to make a creature unblockable thing comes up as a possible win con, especially with Soul Herder, which tends to get, into high power toughness range and stuff like that. I think this card performs well, but is not a necessary addition to the cube and therefore falls into the C category. You're also never starting off a draft with Whirler Rogue. You kind of want to see the texture of your draft first and see if you've got combos with Whirler Rogue before you take it. Torrential Gearhulk. I played against many a Torrential Gearhulk when I was still a constructed player. And I am not a constructed player, but it's still here eating my 5/5s when I recklessly attack into people. So let's go ahead and place Gearhulk into A because I think this is, as far as blue finishers go, like blue balanced finishers that aren't just like completely over the top, dies the Doombladey type cards. I think Torrential Gearhulk is still probably the best in the arena card pool. Maybe of all time, probably not, but it does lend itself to one of the best things that blue can do, which is flashing back Sublime Epiphany, which we'll talk about with Epiphany. But I think Gearhulk deserves to be in high A because it is one of the dedicated control finishers. It's a little narrow because you only put it in control, but it is probably one of the best finishers you have for control decks. And it is just part of the 2-card combo that is the best thing blue can do. So the stats are huge for a flash creature. This could have easily been a 4/5 or something like that. It obviously saw a ton of constructed play. It encourages you to draft a variety of different effects and to have instant speed effects again. Every time, you're not going to see a lot of sorceries in the blue section here because of cards like Torrential Gearhulk. So I don't know. Do I need to explain to people why Torrential Gearhulk is good? I'm curious where people would place this in their own rankings, just because I think I value it highly, and I think my design group for the cube, we all value it highly as a control finisher. But I would be curious if people think this card has dropped off in Modern Magic. I don't think it has, but I still value it quite highly. Mu Yanling. All right. This is another one that I don't value very highly. I don't think it's very good. And the reason for it is that it nerfs an attacker, so it preserves your life total, but it doesn't stop attackers. And a lot of creatures just have attack triggers. When you think about like Legion Loyalist and Adeline and Bomat Courier and these things that just need to declare an attack in order to get their benefit, this doesn't really stop those. It is good if it's a good stable card. If you are stable on the board, this is a card that makes it hard for your opponent to actually kill you. The problem is it's matchup dependent. First off, aggro is not like the best thing you can be doing in the cube anymore. It's still very viable and very good, and there are great aggro decks. This card isn't even that good against like the best aggro decks. If they go 1-drop, 2-drop, and you play Mu Yanling and they just go 3-drop, attack Mu Yanling down, the card didn't do that much. It just saved you a little bit of life. -3 is nice. Like, obviously, you get to go +2, -3, and leave behind a 4/4. Then they have to deal with a 4/4 and still kill Mu Yanling. Again, if you're stable to the point where that's the play pattern for the card, that's fine. But I would say Mu Yanling nerfs a creature and dies a lot more often than it ends up making a 4/4 at all. And I think that puts it pretty low for me. It serves a little bit of a role. There aren't a lot of persistent ways to nerf the damage on the other side of the board. You're relying on things like Thing in the Ice and Rona to actually block creatures. Mu Yanling blocks in a different way, but there are enough high power creatures and stuff like that that I just don't think Mu Yanling is a premium card. But I don't think it's super embarrassing. A lot of people advocate for it, and I think I don't want to cut it necessarily, so I'm not going to put it in D, but I think it's just forgettable. It's not a key part of a lot of different decks. If you just had access to another removal spell or counter spell, I think you should play that most of the time. It is a unique effect that a lot of other cards can't do, and there are situations where your opponent can't get over the hump, and Mu Yanling buys enough time to like land your big planeswalker or something like that, but I just don't think it's a pivotal part of the blue control decks and doesn't really fit anywhere else. Teferi, and we're just gonna, there's like so many Teferi temporal whatevers. I guess there's two. I've liked this Planeswalker quite a bit. I think it's a great little control finisher, which there are definitely multiple slots dedicated to control finishers. It's not one of Blue's best cards. It's not quite as flexible as, say, a Snapcaster Mage that you would put in every deck. You kind of want to play it in a deck that can draw cards with some of the other draw spells, some of the cantrips and stuff like that. So it needs a little bit of support, but the -2 makes a creature that gets really, really big really fast. And if you are able to keep the board clear and keep your opponent off balance and then start actually using the 0 and the -2 ability, you usually produce threats off of those tokens that can take your opponent down. One of the common play patterns is -2, make a thing, draw a card, Teferi goes up to 3, -2, make a thing, and then you just dedicate the rest of Teferi's existence to drawing a card over and over and over again. One of the best blue planeswalkers that we have access to, and we've tried a lot of them, and it has that pivotal like draw a card that you need on a blue planeswalker, I think, to justify its slot. So I'm gonna put this in, I think, the low A, because I think it performs like a low A, and you could take it and say, okay, I'm gonna draft towards Witten with Teferi. So it's a justifiable first pick, but it's not flexible necessarily. It doesn't go in a lot of different decks. It is really a control card through and through, but it's a very good one. So I'm happy to keep it there. All right, classic time, Brainstorm. Do I need to look this one up? Do I need to remind people what Brainstorm does? Here's a fun thing about Brainstorm. This is a classic card that everybody knows that is like one of the defining cards in Eternal formats. It is not good. Well, it's not amazing in formats that cannot fetch. I'm not going to go into my huge Brainstorm rant, but the thing that makes Brainstorm excellent is not necessarily how much it digs or how far it digs into the deck. It's the ability to put cards that you don't need back on top of your library and shuffle them away so that you've effectively just improved 3 card slots in your hand, right? You've replaced Brainstorm with something else, and you've shuffled away 2 other cards you don't need in exchange for 2 extra cards that you drew. It's basically like the ultimate hand shaper if you have shuffle effects, because if you don't have shuffle effects, what ends up happening is, yeah, you dig pretty deep, you might find the effect you need, but then you just draw into the bad cards you put back on top of your library anyway. So I think in our cube specifically, without a lot of fetch lands, without a lot of dedicated top deck manipulation or anything like that, Brainstorm is worse than Consider by a mile. Let's just talk about all 3 of these together. Consider, I think, is our best cantrip right now just because it has a little bit of graveyard synergy. And while we're not super, super high on graveyard-based interactions, there are enough things like Snapcaster, Cybus Siphoner, Torrential Gearhulk, so on and so forth, that you care about sometimes being in an extra spell. And I think Consider lets you look deep enough for a cantrip. And then there's Opt, which I think is just worse than Consider easily. Oh, are we not going to find Opt here? There we go. Perfect. Scry 1, draw a card. This is a nice little cantrip that just replaces itself with sub-selection, right? These are the cantrips that we're playing, at least the instant speed ones. If I had to rank them, I would say Consider, Brainstorm, Opt. I know some people think Opt is better than Brainstorm, but I think as far as finding and digging towards certain effects, Brainstorm is good. It has enough combo potential with things like Search for Azcanta to mill a card away and Kefnet to set up the top of your library that I still value it a little bit higher than Opt. But we play all 3 of these happily, and we're looking for more effects like that. Just give us some like Serum Visions, Ponders, Preordained, stuff like that we don't have access to. The cantrips are very, very important for blue decks. I think they are all like A-level territory just because you can put them in a blue deck, and they are not going to do anything to damage your deck. Your deck will not be worse, ever, if you put a blue cantrip in. And sometimes they actively make your deck better. You can look at all of the things here that trigger off of them, like, triggering your Siege Shark, setting up your Snapcaster Mage. So so on and so forth, your Spell Dancer. These are kind of like key cards that we wish we had more of, and they're so important for blue that I think they deserve to be in the A category, even though they're not blue's best game-winning cards or anything like that, so I'll keep them out of S category. Fading Hope is up next. This is our dedicated bounce spell, or our cheap unsummon. It's not an impressive card. This is like definitionally a B. We play it because it is nice to have a little bit of board interaction at this cost, but unsummons and bounce spells are not at a premium in cubes where everything has like powerful ETBs and stuff like that. Sometimes you end up fading hoping just to kind of buy some time, and you're bouncing a creature that your opponent's just going to replay for value. It doesn't feel good, but you have to do it. I do think it's important to have like one or two of these effects because you just cannot rely on counter spells catching everything. It just doesn't work out that way. And I have found myself in decks where I'm really good at controlling the board, but I do want a card like this just in case something slips through the cracks. So I'm going to say B is just a role player, or rather Fade and Hope is just a role player. It's not a hyper powerful card. The whole Scry one thing is like nonsense. It doesn't matter that much. It's fine to have. But yeah, B feels appropriate for an unsummon. All right, control players, we are entering the the counter magic phase here. Starting off with Spell Pierce. I think Spell Piercer. Is that like Snow Piercer? So Spell Pierce is just a solid little A to me. I think there are very few decks where you can't just put Spell Pierce in the main. It's more about what you expect from opponents than what the makeup of your deck is. You can almost always get something out of Spell Pierce. You very rarely play against a deck that's so creature heavy that Spell Pierce is a dead card. Even the white aggressive decks, like the all-in white aggro decks, are playing like Wedding Invitations and Reckoner Bankbuster and Wandering Emperor, and Spell Pierce slots in nicely. It's obviously, if you're like a control deck and you get all of the premium counter spells, which there aren't a lot of, you probably don't need to main deck Spell Pierce. But if you are like a tempo deck that doesn't have a ton of removal and you're just looking for ways to help curve out but still interact with your opponent, Spell Pierce is a high quality card. So it's a classic, but I think it fits in, and it's a very good silver bullet card that often pushes game. The turn that you Spell Pierce something is usually a turn that swings the game in one direction or the other. Stern, I think I got this one wrong last video. Stern Scolding, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is one of our newest counter spells. This and Saruman's Trickery, and I think this one is great. It hits a very large percentage. I don't remember the number, but it hits every single 1-drop and 2-drop in the cube. And then it just hits a ton of 3-drops as well. Like if you look at Chrome Host Seed Shark, it hits that. It hits like 4s and 5-drops as well. There's cards like Stone Coil Serpent and Angel of Invention that are giant creatures, but on the stack, they have very small power and toughness numbers. And this happens to hit those. So just as a 1-mana interactive spell in a color that doesn't have a lot of those, this does fills a very useful role for those decks. It slots in very easily at 1 mana. And if you compare it to like, not Fatal Push necessarily, but Cut Down in black, it's kind of like the blue Cut Down, right? You should expect it to trade up for a lot of different things, but you shouldn't go in with the expectation that this is going to hit everything your opponent could possibly play. And I think that's a fair expectation to set for a 1-mana counterspell. Censor. Not a huge fan of Censor. We're kind of playing it out of necessity. A lot of these counter spells are like that. I think this is like, at this point, a D-level card that we would happily replace with a different good 2-mana counter spell. We're not talking about like Mana Drain or anything like that, but if we could get like Miscalculation or Refocus or something like that, or what it's not Refocus, but the Replicate, Quench, we would be a lot happier. This one's pretty easy to slot in because you can always cycle it away. But these Force Spikes are usually best on 1-mana spells. Once you're adding extra mana to a Force Spike, you kind of need it to do something else, and cycling isn't really the something else we're looking for. So playing it out of almost obligation, and not exceptionally happy to do so, but we'll be happy to replace this down the line when we get better counter magic. Same kind of goes for Change the Equation. So I pushed pretty hard for this card. This is one of the weirdest looking additions to a list where everything's generically powerful, because we don't play a lot of color hosers, but It is very recognizable to us at this point that red and green are our best colors, our best performing colors, and blue is our least performing color, or our worst performing color. So this just kind of makes sense right now, even though we won't have it in down the line. So I am going to also put this in the D category. It's worth noting that this isn't like a dead card against black or white either, or even in a mirror match. God forbid you get the blue control mirror in our cube. But it's filling a role for right now, and we recognized when we put it in that this is not a long-term card, a long-term solution. So we will be cutting this at some point, but for right now, it's doing what we need to. It is trading up against the cards in the best color that are just completely punishing the blue control deck. So that's the reason it's here, even though it's not ideal. It's not like a fancy, sexy looking card or anything like that to have on these lists. It is worth noting, too, that we talked about quite a few looters. Rona, there's Suspicious Stowaway, there's Ledger Shredder. Situational cards like this do get a little bit better the more looting you have in the cube, because this card's occasionally just absolutely amazing, and then sometimes it's absolutely terrible, so you just loot it away in those situations. The OG Counter Spell. You know it, you love it. Blue Counter Spell. I think this is an S tier card. It's not as blatantly powerful. It's not as like obviously powerful as these other cards. Like when you think about the cards that are winning you the game, it's usually the creatures that are actually dealing the damage to your opponent. But you got to give credit where credit is due. Counterspell, despite having a restrictive mana cost, is what a 2-mana counterspell looks like. That isn't just finicky. Like, look at all these other finicky counterspells, and then look at counterspell, and this is just the one that says no. Like, absolutely no. It doesn't matter how much mana you have. It doesn't matter whether it's the early game or the late game. This is going to trade 1-for-1 with something, and it's never going to be better than that, but there's so many situations where counterspell just gives you a safety net that some of the other counter spells in this section can't do, and I think that deserves to be in S tier. All right, let's talk about two together real quick. We have Essence Scatter, which is, classic limited card. 1 blue, counter a creature. Helps if I type in the actual name. So Essence Scatter, 1 in a blue, counter a creature spell. Half the cube is creatures, so this counters half the spells at an even cost, and doesn't matter how much mana your opponent has. It's fine. It trades 1-for-1. It is a serviceable counter spell. And then there's Reject, which would get a D on art alone, but honestly, it performs fine. It's kind of like an Essence Scatter that can also hit Planeswalkers. It gives your opponent an out if they have a bunch of mana, but 3 is enough to the point where this usually counters important things, and it does Exile instead, which is somewhat important for like the pesky black creatures, the recursive creatures, and stuff like that. But we've actually come to the conclusion that Reject in this cube is usually better than Essence Scatter, but since we're trying to give blue control a strong identity, and we need as many counter spells as possible to do that we just play both until we can improve the quality of these 2-mana counter spells. Neither of these are premium cards, but we actually think Reject is a little bit better than Essence Scatter. And realistically, I think these are like middle-of-the-road counter spells that belong in B tier. Probably worse than most of the like little creatures. And realistically, like occupy in the same space. Like, right next to each other. Yes, Reject's a little bit better than Essence Scatter, but the main appeal of putting this in your deck is that you have a 2-mana way to just answer a creature, and they do a fine job of that. Make Disappear. This is one that Chris is not a huge fan of. It's Quench. Quench is one of my least favorite cards of all time, but it has Casualty 1. Obviously, our blue section is not really poised to be sacrificing creatures. We have tried blue creatures in the past with Exploit and stuff like that require sacrifices to really take off, and we've just determined that sacrifice is not something our blue section is really capable of. But this is added value on top of something. You can do it to like basically guarantee you counter a spell. Hopefully you don't have to, because you're probably sacrificing a real creature in those situations. But Quench is serviceable, and this is just Quench with upside. Again, it's not like a sleek, powerful counterspell. It has more applications in Constructed than it does in a cube environment that doesn't support it that well. But we need our counterspells on 2 in order for our blue control sections to keep up. So this is kind of like in the same exact category as the other 2, but probably a little bit better because it catches most spells, even though you do see this Quench text drop off significantly in the late game. There are a lot of situations where your opponent can actually pay the 2 and your card is just dead. I've had it come up, and it feels bad when you just can't even cast your counter spell because it's not going to counter the thing you want to target. Memory Lapse. Memory Lapse, in my opinion, is the second best counterspell to counterspell, and I think it belongs in S tier just because it plays in so many different decks. It's not the best counterspell for control decks because if it's countering something that's really hard for you to deal with, it just puts it on a delay for a turn, and then you still have to find a way to deal with it. But it does 1-for-1. It's not quite a bounce spell, right? It is card neutral. Your opponent is down a card, you're down a card. It's not quite as good as counterspell, even though there are decks that I think would prefer Memory Lapse, and it is just absolutely backbreaking in any proactive deck. If you're playing an Izzet deck that's just curving out, playing creatures, and can find a slot or a spot or a turn to just keep up 2 mana for Memory Lapse, it's often very hard for your opponent to find a way to deal with that. I mentioned it with Reprieve in the last video, but the blue-white tempo decks that are able to just pressure the opponent and then keep up some sort of stack interaction make very, very good use of cards like Memory Lapse and Reprieve and stuff like that. So the best home for this is a proactive Izzet deck or a proactive Azorius deck, but you can absolutely just put this in a control deck, counter your opponent's 4-drop, put it on a delay, and then use your remaining mana on something else for the turn. So I do think Memory Lapse gets there as an S-tier quality card. And I think that's about it for blue S-tier counter spells. We're not going to see any others on this list. All right, moving along, we have Negate here is just a classic. I think Negate is like a serviceable card. I think it's on average worse than your Spell Pierces and your counter spells for sure, but most of the situational counter spells, like you would think this is comparable to Essence Scatter, but it comes up a lot more often that you want to counter a creature than a non-creature. It's kind of in the same exact category, though. Again, you can see how a lot of these 2-mana counter spells are just kind of like filler counter spells that are just kind of hopefully countering things, but don't always get the job done. We are looking to improve the quality of these cards over time, but we do need Wizards to give us some better counter spells, which is not likely because people hate playing against them. So fingers crossed that we can improve these slots over time, but for now they're all kind of like bread and butter filler cards. Tezzeret's Ambition, or this is Tezzeret's Reckoning, I believe. Reckoning. Okay, so for those who don't know this card, it's an alchemy card, but it's a very inoffensive one. It's like a different type of impulse or a moment of truth / anticipate type thing. So 2 mana, instant, exile 3 random cards from your library face down, and for as long as they remain, you may play one of those cards. So you don't have any say in what cards get exiled, but you basically get, as Chris likes to describe it, a 3-card hand for a little while, and you get to kind of determine when to cast one of those cards. The other 2 just remain exiled forever. It's a solid piece. There's been a lot of back and forth argument about whether this is better than Impulse, and I advocated for Moment of Truth for a long time, but people basically bullied me out of that card, even though I do think it's better than Tezzeret's Reckoning. No matter, I think they're all in the conversation. It's come clear to us that we want our cantrips to be 1 mana, or we want them to be really good selection tools, and Tezzeret's Reckoning falls into that latter category where you get a lot of flexibility based on what cards you see. Now if you ask Chris, every time he casts this, he's going to exile a Wrath, a draw spell, and a land. Like, it's always going to be the perfect 3 cards to make a informed decision based on what the opponent does. It doesn't always play like that, but sometimes it does, and just having the knowledge of what you can cast before you have to commit to picking one of those cards like you would with, like, Anticipate or Impulse does push this up a lot. It is a nice selection tool. I think this is like a high B. I think Teld would put this at like an A. It's pretty easy to slot into decks, but decks don't necessarily even need these. I think the real home for this is a control shell where you do have Wraths and you're hoping to spike a Wrath and determine whether or not you need to cast that or just cast something else if your opponent's not sticking creatures. So I think this is like a high B level card. Might even be like the highest of Bs, but I could take it or leave it, honestly, as I could with any Anticipate variant. They're just not the best cards in your deck by any means, but this one gives you a lot of selection and a lot of time to make your choice. So it's it's unique. It's unique, and we also like that it's an alchemy card that's not like trying to do something completely stupid. This card could honestly even exist in paper if they really wanted to. Next up, Archmage's Charm. Charming little addition. So let's just go ahead and stick this in. I almost put it in D. I'm going to go ahead and put it in C and low C because it is very experimental, but I think if you put in work during the draft, this card does pay you off. All three modes are relevant, and when you're trying to sculpt a blue section where everything operates at instant speed, or most things operate at instant speed, giving you flexibility and choices on those cards is just more ways to outplay your opponent, right? Obviously, blue counter target spell would not be a card we would ever play, but when you get to tack that on and do the, I'm going to counter spell or draw a card type thing, or draw 2 cards, that's great. And then every now and then you get to snag a 1-drop card, which don't put a lot of stock in this last ability, but when it does come up, it's usually backbreaking. You like snag your opponent's Bomat Courier that they spent like 4 turns attacking with, and they don't have the mana up to sack it or something like that. It's good stuff, but Archmage's Charm, realistically, you have to put in a lot more work for this card, whereas most of the other cards in the cube, you don't really have to work for. You just draft them and put them together with other powerful cards. This is one of the few cards in our cube right now that require you to be responsible during the draft and make sure your mana base is good and aren't just inherently powerful because you have to be able to cast a blue card. If you can do that easily, like if you can sculpt a mana base where blue is not a problem, then this card is going to be very powerful, but that mana cost does hold it back a little bit, stops it from being an all-star card, and probably puts it in a category where we're going to lose it at some point for something a little bit less restrictive. Exclude is up next. This is a card we brought back recently to try and fight the Green Scourge. We actually even cut this card from our Peasant cube for a while because of how backbreaking it is against creature-based strategies in that cube. But here, it feels like a nice little role player. It's definitely in the B category somewhere. Probably better than a lot of these fiddly ones. Like, I kind of want to put it under the Fairy Mastermind here. Just because when you do get to fire this off and draw something, it's doing exactly what you want a counter spell to do. It's dealing with something, it's dealing with a threat, and then it's not costing you a card. And one of blue control's problems right now is that you usually have to commit entire turns to either countering something or to drawing cards, and you rarely get to do both in the same turn. So it's really hard to find the niche turns where you actually get card advantage without falling behind on board or taking some damage. And Exclude kind of lets you play both ends of the spectrum there without losing out much. Obviously, the downside of this card being that if your opponent just jams like a Planeswalker or something like a Ranger class into it, it's like, oh, haha, gotcha. So narrow, but very powerful when it actually hits something. Saruman's Trickery. Saruman's. This is a cancel that makes a 1/1. Again, something we really want our counterspells to do. We were very happy to pick this card up. I think it's one of the best cancel variants we've ever had. We've played a lot of different ones in the cube, but being able to affect the board while also doing the control plan is very important. That 1/1 can go into a lot of different things. In fact, it's like an expendable body for your Make Disappear. It can actually pressure a Planeswalker or defend one of your Planeswalkers. Does a lot of different things, but still a cancel is a cancel. While I think this is one of the best cancels that we've had, I'm going to put it pretty high in the kind of clunky counterspell territory. It's not a premium counterspell, but it is a step in the right direction for what we need our counterspells to do in order for a control to be, a big contender in this cube. Thirst for, what is this? This is Thirst for Discovery? Yeah, Thirst for Meaning's the enchantment one. Okay, I'm going to come out and say I don't really care for this card very much. It's a good rate. Like, very often this puts you up on cards. It doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Like, it's a 3-mana instant speed draw spell. Usually just filters a little bit, but it's hard for me to peg why I don't like this card that much and why I don't play it. I guess I would just rather have cantrips, and the fact that I only get so many of those makes me like this a little bit less. But this is like a C-level card for me, but it's so inoffensive, and it is actually like a decent enough card that I'll put it at high C. I guess it's the spell decks that really want this. The control decks have better raw card advantage. the tempo decks don't really want to spend 3 mana on just pure card advantage. So the spell decks are the ones that want to cast spells that draw into more spells and just kind of chain them off together. So that's the home for it, but that deck also just has a bunch of spells already with the cantrips and cheap counter spells and stuff like that. So it's a card that you can put in a deck, but it's not a necessity for any of those decks. Again, you have to be hard pressed for card advantage to be like, oh, I really want Thirst for Discovery. Usually, if you're looking for a clunky to expensive draw spell, you want one of the other ones that we're going to talk about. So Thirst is like on my chopping block, but it's still a fine card on rate in terms of like the effect that you get out of it that I can't quite put it in D. I suppose we could talk about the 4 mana draw 2s together. Behold the Multiverse is the foretell one that lets you scry 2, draw 2. Kind of lets you commit 2 mana early on to have a flexible draw spell later. You give up your second turn, you foretell Behold the Multiverse, and you're not really intending to just like fire this off on turn 3, but what you want to do is wait until like turn 5 or 6, hold up some of your instant speed creatures and stuff like that, and just have a really good double spell turn. And of course, if you just draw this on turn 4, you can just fire it off as a 4 mana draw spell. And then there's Memory Deluge, which I think a lot of us would agree. I'm actually curious where people land on it, but I think this is the best 4 mana draw 2 option, even though it doesn't technically draw the cards, just because it lets you dig so deep. It's kind of like a dig through time that always costs 4 mana and then gives you flashback. This is like the card draw inevitability card that you want, just because you know if this card is in your hand that you are never going to run out of things to do in the game. You're always going to have somewhere to sink your mana. You're always going to be able to find other cards, and it digs deep enough that if you're looking for situational things like wraths or single target removal spells or finishers, it digs deep enough that you're going to be able to find those things. Coincidentally, this card actually gets worse with mana reduction abilities, which we're not playing a lot of. So I think Deluge is better than Behold, but I think Behold is quite good. So if I had to say, I think Deluge is like the draw spell that you want, and it's one of the better ones. I have a hard time putting it above the cantrips because of how important those are, but I'll put Deluge in the A right below the cantrips, and then I'll put Behold like high B if it lets me. Just because these card advantage tools are so important to the control decks, to how they operate. You just need card advantage in those decks, and the raw card advantage cards are great. You can't commit too many slots in a cube to effects like this, but I think we have landed on the best of what we have so far. Dismiss is up next, which a lot of people would, in fact, dismiss. Where are you at? It's hiding over there. Found you. Okay, get out of here. So dismiss, cryptic command at home. Cryptic command without flexibility. Dismiss is realistically a C. It is a counterspell that we're playing because we want our counterspells to look like this, even though it's not great. We put this in knowing that like it's never going to be an all-star counterspell. It overperformed a little bit, but not enough that I think it's like a card that you want to first pick or anything like that. It is a very good interactive tool for decks that are already very good at stabilizing. If you can keep your opponent off balance and just trade 1 for 1 or 2 for 1 in the early game and then get to a point where you can hold up Dismiss, Dismiss can often push things in your favor by just countering a key card or and turn it into another card. It's a lot like Exclude. The problem with Exclude, of course, being that it doesn't counter anything. Dismiss lets you pay extra mana to counter anything. So these are kind of like the situational counter spells that we're stuck with to try and give blue some sort of edge somewhere, even knowing that they're not like premium cards. So I imagine over time, maybe over the course of another year, year and a half, 2 years, these blue situational counter spells will be edged out for cheaper, better counter spells, whether those are ones that already exist and get added to Arena or just new ones along the same lines as like Stern Skulldin or Saruman's Trickery. So Dismiss is not long for the world, but it does perform well enough that we don't need to like emergency cut it from the cube or anything like that. Sublime. Sublime Epiphany probably has like more fans than anybody else in the cube. This is one of Blue's best finishers, And we've already mentioned the Torrential Gearhulk thing. It is one of those cards that, like, if it's in your hand, your whole strategy becomes about maximizing this card. Even though if you keep a hand that's like slow and clunky with a Sublime Epiphany in it, and then your opponent just like curves out 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, sometimes you get to the point where you just can't even cast this card and you die with it in your hand. So I think Gearhulk is probably more important as a finisher because it just puts pressure on your opponent, actually closes out the game in 4 turns, on its own. I think I have to put Epiphany a little bit lower than that, but just below it, because it kind of requires that you have a creature on board, which is not too hard with some of the flash 3/1s and stuff like that. These are very close in my estimation. If I'm looking for a blue finisher, I think I'm happy to snap up either one. And obviously you can do the combo with both of them, but I am going to defer to the creature as my finisher just because, again, it can attack your opponent down, whereas sometimes Sublime Epiphany just ends up being like counter spell draw a card and doesn't necessarily get you closer to winning the game. Obviously, there are times that it does, but there are also just as many times where you just need to run this out there. Your opponent can suss it out and play in such a way that Sublime Epiphany is not such a huge blowout for them. Okay, rounding out, we got 8 cards left. Some of them are easy to talk about. Thraben Inspector, Thraben Crab. This is one of my favorite cards, probably of all time. Just as far as a common goes, this is just a well-designed common. There are times, this is like our secret 4th cantrip, even though it's a slow cantrip, it requires some extra mana investment. But there are times where this is just so much better than the other cantrips because of the body it puts on board. Anytime your opponent is in a position where they have to use a removal spell to kill that crab to keep pressuring you, you feel like a god, right? And then they kill you and you feel less like a god. But Hard Evidence is in the conversation with these, and I think it sways the aggro matchups so much, like when you're the control deck against an aggro deck, that I'm actually going to place this like on the higher end of the cantrips. As far as like spell casting decks go, you're just very happy to rattle off any of these. But I think that 0/3 blocker on a cantrip, which none of these other cards do that. These all have their own advantages, and they're much better at like digging for answers and giving you selection for the cards you look at. But if all you care about is playing the cantrips to trigger your spell cast and stuff, Hard Evidence is like the best one because it keeps you alive while doing it. It's just not the best at like finding specific kinds of cards. And I think that all evens out to like this overperforms the other ones in so many matchups that I'm just going to put it in the higher end. Chart of Course is up next. Classic B card. You kind of need to shape your deck in a way where this card is good in order to play it. You can kind of just throw it in a deck and then it's like a Tormenting Voice, like a better Tormenting Voice because you get to draw first. I do want some of these cheap creatures that can attack before getting it. I don't tend to play Chart of Course that often because I guess I don't play blue decks that attack that often, even though you can just put this in kind of any blue deck. A little bit better than the clunky counter spells, I think. A little bit worse than some of the efficient creatures that enable it. So I'm going to stick it right in the middle of the B. Oh, look, Ether Channeler's still right there in the Bs. That's where I want it to be. Baral's Expertise. This one is waffly. Blue doesn't really have board wipes. We're not going to play River's Rebuke and Flood of Tears and Cyclonic Rift, these like super expensive ones. But you do need blue to have something native to its own color to catch you up in case you fall really far behind. And Baral's Expertise is that card. Now, that being said, Baral's Expertise has been in and out of this cube as much as like any other card. So it's obviously not like an S or an A. It is a C in terms of like its necessity in the cube, but I think it's a high C, probably below Whirler Rogue, but ahead of a lot of the more kind of underperforming type cards, which again, this is here because because we kind of have to play it. Baral's Expertise, though, like there are plenty of matchups where this card is just not good enough. We've already mentioned how bounce isn't that good. And then for all of the situations where this card isn't good enough, there are the ones where you get to bounce 3 of your opponent's things and then cast a creature for free off of it or something like that, and then you're just super far ahead. So it has polarizing matchups, and it does fine, although there are many situations where this card is just not that great. Again, your opponent has a bunch of hasty creatures or something like that, and this is supposed to be your answer. Plus, if you pair it with white or you pair it with black, a lot of times you can pick up the Languishes and the Wrath of Gods and stuff like that in those colors to the point where you don't necessarily need it. So it's not a necessary addition to the cube. It is our attempt to seed something into blue that can give you a way to catch up in a game that's spiraling out of control. And you could always play it at the top end of your tempo decks, even though it's a little bit clunky at this cost for that. So, decent card, one that I could see cutting for the right interaction down the line. Time Warp. Time Warp. Some players have told us that Time Warp feels unfair in this cube. I'm going to put it at S. I think Time Warp is S, and I think it's high S. Now, I want Brazen Borrower in every blue deck. There are some decks where I don't necessarily feel like I need Time Warp, but the opportunity cost on Time Warp is like almost non-existent. The thing is, you have to get to 5 mana. If you're the type of deck that is going to fold to an aggro deck, you absolutely plan on doing nothing turns 1 through 4 and you anticipate dying before you hit your 5th land, then yeah, maybe don't put Time Warp in your deck. But if you are a deck that plans on interacting with your opponent and not just fold into creatures, then you can just put Time Warp in your deck, and the worst case scenario is that you hit 5 mana and you get to just cycle your turn for another turn, right? The joke being that this is Explore, draw a card, play an extra land, and that's all it does. But it doesn't, when on the turns where you're casting Time Warp, you don't lose anything, right? You have to get to 5 mana, but when you actually get to cast the card, you don't lose anything. And then there are the times where you actually have an established board and Time Warp is nuts. When you have an active Planeswalker on board, when you're in a position to actually attack your opponent and you get to Time Warp and get another combat with another draw step and another land drop, Time Warp is just excellent in so many decks. And the floor of the card is that it gets to just cycle your turn into another turn, which matters for a lot of other cards as well. So I think Time Warp deserves to be an S tier, even though it took me a while to come around on the card. And we've received like every end of the complaints about this. Some people think it's not good enough for the cube. People think it's one of the actively broken cards in the cube that shouldn't be in it at this power level. I think it is very, very strong. Deserves to be an S tier card, but isn't breaking the cube in such a way that we have to like emergency ban it. 4 more. Search for Azcanta. I am going to just come out and say that I'm very low on this card these days. This was in the original cube, I believe. It was like a classic constructed card. I think the format is tight enough and fast enough, and every deck is just playing on curve so well and putting some sort of pressure, whether that's like active pressure or defensive pressure on the opponent, that it's really hard to justify a 2-mana card that just sets up some draws, even though you kind of have to recognize that Azcanta is a really powerful land. Some games just don't lend themselves to you being able to tap out on turn 2 for something that's not going to do anything for like another 3-4 turns. And we're not playing like Turbo Azcanta, right? Again, with the cantrips, this card would get a lot better if you could just go turn 2 Azcanta, turn 3 cantrip, 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 turn 4 threatening to flip it or something like that. So I've actually brought this up in conversations before as a card that probably is at the end of its lifespan in the cube. And some people have talked me down off of that, saying, yeah, I still think it's good enough. The card selection over time is decent. You just need to back it up with the right kind of cards. But I do think it takes a lot more work now to not die when you just cast cards like this than it did before. And maybe that's an exaggeration a little bit. The reward is definitely there, but the opportunities to sneak in cards like this when people are pressuring you from all angles is just not great, especially with Gruul being like as powerful as these red decks, these green beatdown ramp decks. They just put so much pressure on you so fast and have so many hasty threats that just using your second turn to set up later turns is just not doing it. You really need to operate at instant speed. You really need to make sure you have like the counter spell for your opponent's Quest and Beast and stuff like that. So I think this is at the end of its life, but curious what others think. Shark Typhoon. Here's the thing about Shark Typhoon. I used to think this was the best blue card in the cube. I still think it's very good. I do think it is a notch below the best possible cards, and in the conversation with the other blue finishers, it is still, I think, better than the Gear Hulk and the Sublime Epiphany, because you can just use this earlier in the game to chump block and cycle, and I value that quite a bit. When you're under a lot of pressure and you don't have time to get to your 6-mana plays, you just need to buy another turn to find your Wrath or something like that, or to land your your Languish, then Shark Typhoon does a good job of just keeping you alive for an extra turn. So I'm going to give it a nod above these, even though I do think it is a step below a lot of other things. And again, that's just an ode to the format being pretty fast these days. The green decks and the red decks putting a lot of pressure on people, that you just don't get to the point where you're making like an 8/8 Shark, even though if you are able to control the game to the late game, like, this is just an excellent finisher. Plays at instant speed, plays at a lot of different points along the curve. Don't really put a lot of stock into being able to cast this as a permanent, because we don't really do that, but that is an option as well. So flexible enough that I'm going to put it above the other blue control finishers here, but a little bit finicky enough and a little bit behind the curve often enough that I'm going to keep it out of the S range. And that leads us with the lands. Hall of Storm Giants. This is a good blue control finisher and one that you can slot into a deck very easily. Notably, if this comes in tapped, it's actually hurting a control deck quite a bit. You just can't afford to have like a bunch of tap lands in your control deck that often. And you don't get like a huge benefit in your control deck of having this come in untapped. It's not like the white or red or green ones where you just absolutely need to jam something on turn 1 to keep up with things. Blue decks really just have like their cantrips on turn 1. So I don't think this coming in untapped is like a huge thing, but it is huge that it hurts you when it comes in tapped. However, as a finisher that you can just hide in your mana base and is very, very hard to interact with, I think this is just excellent. If you're like one of those Wrath-based decks, you can just avoid creatures altogether and use something like Hall of Storm Giants to win. But you do need to be very committal. Like, you need to get to the point where you can activate this attack and just not take a huge crackback. So I think this is like an A category finisher. Pretty easy to slot in. Like, obviously, we're not playing a lot of blue utility lands, so being able to add a little bit of extra oomph to your mana base is nice. I'm going to put it here. I value the Memory Delusion, the cantrips. Those are kind of like the dividing point in the A, the cantrips and the draw spell. And that leaves us with Odawara. And I'm going to say the same thing I did about Iganjo. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this low A. I put Iganjo in S tier, and I kind of stick to that. This one's a little bit more expensive than Iganjo and doesn't really benefit as much from the reduced channel cost, which isn't a huge player here. But this card is not necessarily something you need to first pick. It's no opportunity cost to put this in your deck, and that's why it's so powerful, because it just lets you replace an island with a card that occasionally just interacts with the board, which is extremely powerful to be able to upgrade your mana base like that. But you don't necessarily need to first pick Odawara, so I will leave it out of S range. And this does deal with something. It does get something off the board, but only temporarily. Your opponent's just going to go ahead and replay at some point the thing that you bounce back, whereas Iganjo usually just kills something permanently. So I think I will put this a little bit lower than I had Iganjo. Now, that's it for blue. If we look here, it's interesting that we consider blue our weakest color, because there's a lot of S tier stuff, way more than we had in white, and there's a ton of A tier cards, at least cards that I consider A tier. But if you look a lot closer, like these cantrips and stuff, like there's not a lot of A tier stuff that's just like, this is gonna win the game. I mean, I guess there's a decent amount of that. The problem is a lot of the B tier and C tier stuff that like holds the deck together and lets you do the powerful things with these cards are just medium. Like your Essence Scatters, your Rejects, your Make Disappears. They're just medium ways to get you to the A's and the S's. So this is the stuff we really need to work on. A lot of this we're playing out of necessity rather than being really excited. And we would like to upgrade a couple of these slots over time. So that's where I stand on all the blue cards. I said I was going to be a lot quicker about this, and it turns out I just talked as much as I did during the white one. Turns out talking about 51 cards takes a little while. But you can do your own evaluation of the blue cards. I will have links to this tier list and to our Discord down below. So if you want to go ahead and do a tier list of the blue cards and share it with us in the Discord, come find us down below. We'll be happy to have you. And we can have a discussion about these cards. And obviously, again, it's just really funny. The D's are like some of the things that I'm always curious what people think about, because I know for a fact like some of these are cards that people covet very highly and I don't. And that difference of opinions is just a good conversation starter. So that's going to go ahead and do it with the blue cards. We'll be back with black sometime soon. My name is Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I will see you all next time.